I had always been the devoted faculty wife, the perfect partner behind the scenes of my husband Richard's meteoric rise to department chair at Westlake University. For 23 years, I organized faculty dinners in our home, edited his academic papers, and sacrificed my own career in museum curation to raise our daughter Emma while he built his reputation in the economics department. So when he stood up at Emma's graduation party in our backyard, clinked his glass for attention, and announced to our 40 guests that he was leaving me for Veronica, his 29-year-old department secretary, it felt like I was suddenly cast in someone else's tragedy. The silence that fell over our festively decorated patio was absolute. Emma's face drained of color, her graduation cap still perched on her head from the photos we'd taken just an hour before. Our friends, colleagues Richard had worked with for decades, and neighbors who had watched Emma grow up, froze with champagne glasses midway to their lips. Richard stood there in his tailored blazer, the May sunshine highlighting the silver, at his temples that I once found distinguished, looking almost relieved as he dropped this bomb on the celebration I had spent weeks planning. "Catherine and I have grown apart," he continued with clinical detachment, as though describing an economic theory to his students. "Veronica and I have developed a deep connection, and we've decided to begin our life together. Today seems fitting, a day of new beginnings for Emma, and now for me as well." I couldn't breathe. The carefully arranged platters of Emma's favorite foods, the string lights I'd spent hours hanging in our oak tree, the congratulatory banner with her university colors, all of it became a blur as I struggled to comprehend what was happening. 23 years of marriage, of building a life together, reduced to a public dismissal at what should have been one of our proudest moments as parents. Emma stood up abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the stone patio. "Are you serious?" Her voice trembled with rage. "At my graduation party? This is how you choose to do this?" I reached for her hand, instinctively trying to protect her even as my own world collapsed. Richard had the audacity to look surprised at her reaction, as though he expected applause for his honesty. Our closest friend Mark stepped forward, placing himself between Richard and the stunned crowd. "I think that's enough, Rich. This isn't the time or place." While Mark led Richard away from the gathering, I sat frozen, decades of memories flashing before me. Our wedding in the university chapel, Richard's triumphant smile when he got tenure, the night Emma was born when he promised we would always be a team. How had we arrived at this moment? When had I become dispensable? Martha, my friend of 20 years, slipped into the chair beside me, her arm around my shoulders. "Let's get you inside," she whispered. I glanced up to see Emma already disappearing into the house, her graduation gown billowing behind her like a flag of retreat. Several guests were quietly gathering their things, embarrassment and pity etched on their faces. Others stood in small clusters, already beginning the dissection of our marriage that would undoubtedly fuel campus gossip for months. As Martha guided me through my own garden, past the rose bushes I had tenderly cultivated for years, I caught sight of Richard by the side gate, phone to his ear. Was he calling her? Was Veronica waiting to hear how his grand announcement had gone? The woman who had smiled at me in department functions? Who had sent Emma a birthday card just last year signed from the econ department staff? Who had selected the retirement gift I gave Richard's predecessor? She had been waiting in the eye. Wings of my marriage all along. Inside our home, the federal-style house we had restored room by room over 2 decades, Emma was pacing the kitchen, tears streaming down her face, her cap discarded on the counter beside the 3-tiered graduation cake I had special ordered with her university mascot and summa cum laude honors piped in school colors. "How long?" she demanded when she saw me. "How long has this been going on? Did you know?" The question struck like a physical blow. Did I know? Had I suspected and ignored the signs? The late nights at the office preparing for accreditation reviews, the conferences that suddenly required his attendance when they hadn't before, the new shirts and cologne, the password added to his phone. Perhaps some part of me had known, but acknowledging it would have meant facing the unraveling of everything I had built my life around. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Richard and I met during my final year of graduate school in art history. I was curating a small exhibition on economic influences in Renaissance art at the University Museum, and he was a young assistant professor asked to consult on the project. He arrived at our first meeting with thoughtful questions and genuine interest in my perspective, a refreshing change from the dismissive male academics I'd encountered throughout my studies. We worked closely for 3 months, and by the exhibition's opening night, we were inseparable. I fell in love with his brilliant mind, his passion for teaching, and the future he described for us. Academic partners, each pursuing our interests while building a life centered around ideas and education. We married at the university chapel the following spring, surrounded by colleagues and mentors who predicted great things for both of us. I had been offered a promising position at the Westlake University Museum, while Richard was making waves in the economics department with his innovative research. The early years of our marriage were a whirlwind of intellectual discussions, renovating our historic home near campus and establishing ourselves in the university community. I organized dinner parties where Richard could connect with influential department members, edited his papers for clarity, and created a home that became a hub for academic gatherings. When I became pregnant with Emma 4 years into our marriage, we faced our first real crossroads. The museum position demanded extensive travel for acquisitions and exhibition planning. Richard was approaching tenure review and needed to focus entirely on his research and publication record. "It's just timing," he explained when we discussed our options. "My career is at a critical juncture. Once I have tenure, you can pursue whatever you want, and I'll support you completely." It seemed logical then. A temporary pause in my career trajectory, a practical solution for our family. I took a part-time position cataloging the university's collection, allowing me flexible hours with our infant daughter. Richard secured tenure. The following year, celebrated with champagne and promises of my turn next. But somehow, my turn never came. The economics department began grooming Richard for leadership. There were more papers to edit, more dinner parties to host, more faculty, wives to befriend to smooth his path. Emma needed stability, continuity. At least that's how we framed it. Each year, the gap in my resume widened, making a return to full-time curation more difficult to justify. Meanwhile, Richard's reputation grew. Department committees, university, senate, published research, invited lectures. "You're indispensable to my success," he would tell me, kissing the top of my head as I prepared briefing notes for his meeting with the university president or organized a reception for a visiting scholar. "We're a team, Kath. Your contributions make everything possible." I believed him. I chose to believe him. Our dynamic worked, Richard the public intellectual, me the supportive partner making his achievements possible while raising our academically gifted daughter. Emma grew into a remarkable young woman, brilliant like her father but with an empathy and emotional intelligence I'd like to think came from me. She watched me manage our household, volunteer at the University Art Center, host Richard's colleagues, and navigate the complex social hierarchy of academic spouses. "You're the power behind the throne," she once joked when she was in high school, after watching me skillfully mediate a tense discussion between Richard and the dean at our dinner table. When Richard was appointed department chair 7 years ago, it felt like a shared achievement. The congratulatory notes and emails acknowledged my role. "Couldn't have happened without Catherine's support," colleagues wrote. "The department is getting 2 brilliant minds for the price of 1. I was proud of our partnership, of the carefully constructed life we had built in the red brick confines of Westlake University. I had no reason to suspect anything when Veronica joined the department 3 years ago. She was efficient, professional, and deferential in our interactions. If she stayed late working with Richard, it seemed natural for a department chair and his secretary. If she accompanied him to conferences as administrative support, it was simply proper departmental procedure. When she appeared at our home bearing files or department paperwork on weekends, I welcomed her with coffee and homemade scones. There were moments, perhaps, a laugh that lingered too long, an inside joke I wasn't part of, Richard mentioning, her name with increasing frequency. But after 2 decades of marriage, suspicion seemed beneath us. We were established, secure, respected within our community. Besides, Richard had always been charming with everyone: students, colleagues, university, donors. His ability to make people feel special was part of his professional success. As Emma's graduation approached this spring, I focused entirely on celebrating her achievement. She had earned a double major in economics and art history, a beautiful blend of both our interests, and had been accepted to an impressive graduate program. I threw myself into planning the perfect graduation party, ordering custom invitations, researching caterers, and transforming our backyard into a festive venue worthy of her accomplishments. Richard seemed distracted, but I attributed it to end-of-semester stress and his upcoming department budget presentations. The night before Emma's graduation ceremony, I found Richard in his study staring at his laptop, an odd expression on his face. "Everything okay?" I asked, setting down a cup of tea on his desk. He startled slightly, closing whatever he was looking at. "Fine," he said too quickly. "Just reviewing my department reports." He didn't meet my eyes. "The party planning all set?" "Everything's ready," I had assured him that night, smoothing a hand over his shoulder. "The caterers arrive at 2 tomorrow. The florist is delivering at noon, and the string quartet Emma loved at the dean's reception last fall is confirmed for 4. I hesitated, sensing his distraction. "Are you sure you're all right? You've seemed somewhere else these past few weeks." Richard had finally looked up at me then, and for a moment, I thought I glimpsed something. Regret? Guilt? But it vanished so quickly I convinced myself I'd imagined it. "Just department politics," he said, squeezing my hand. "Let's focus on Emma's big day." The graduation ceremony itself was beautiful. We sat in the reserved section for faculty families, Richard dignified in his academic regalia, as befit his position. When Emma's name was called and she crossed the stage, Richard reached for my hand, and we shared a moment of genuine pride. I remember thinking how perfect everything was. Our brilliant daughter beginning her adult life, my husband distinguished and respected beside me, 2 decades of choices validated in this culmination of our family project. Martha sat on my other side, her camera ready to capture Emma's moment. "You've done an amazing job with her, Kath," she whispered. "She's extraordinary." I had smiled, tears of joy threatening to spill. Martha had been there since Emma was born, a fellow faculty wife who had become my closest confidant. Unlike me, she had maintained her career as a literature professor while raising her children, and sometimes I wondered if I should have fought harder to do the same. After the ceremony, we gathered for photos on the quad. Emma, radiant in her cap and gown, Richard and I flanking her with parental pride. The department dean stopped by to congratulate us, reminding everyone within earshot that Emma had received the department's highest honors in economics. "Following in her father's footsteps," the dean had said, clapping Richard on the back. No mention of her equally impressive achievements in art history, my field. Some patterns were so established they became invisible. We drove home separately, Richard direct from campus to oversee the final party preparations, while I took Emma to lunch with her grandparents at their favorite restaurant downtown. My in-laws had always been politely distant with me, making It clear they'd expected their brilliant son to marry someone with career ambitions matching his own. 23 years later, they had become resigned to me, though I sometimes caught my mother-in-law's evaluating gaze when Richard described his latest academic accomplishment. "What a lovely lunch," my father-in-law had said as we were leaving, kissing Emma's cheek. "We're so proud of what you've accomplished." Then, almost as an afterthought, "Catherine, the party arrangements sound wonderful. Always the perfect hostess." The familiar reduction of my identity to domestic talent stung as always, but I smiled and thanked him, accustomed to swallowing such microaggressions for family harmony. When Emma and I arrived home, the transformation of our backyard was complete. Market lights twinkled from trees, tables were dressed in linens matching Emma's university colors, and arrangements of spring flowers created the sophisticated atmosphere I'd envisioned. The caterers moved efficiently through our kitchen, the bartender was setting up near the brick patio, and everything looked perfect. Too perfect in retrospect, as though the universe were setting the stage for maximum dramatic contrast. Richard emerged from his study when he heard us, kissing Emma's cheek and nodding approvingly at the decor. "Excellent work as always, Kath," he said, but his eyes didn't quite meet mine. He seemed unusually tense, checking his watch repeatedly as guests began to arrive. I was too busy greeting people to pay much attention to Richard's odd behavior. Faculty colleagues, family friends, Emma's former teachers and classmates filled our garden, creating the multi-generational celebration I had planned. Several of Richard's senior colleagues congratulated me on Emma's achievements and, predictably, on Richard's recent success securing a major departmental grant. I played my familiar role, gracious, engaging, deflecting praise back to my husband and daughter. It wasn't until we gathered everyone for the toasts that I noticed Veronica standing quietly near the garden entrance. She hadn't been invited, at least not by me, but I assumed Richard had included the department staff as a courtesy. I caught her eye and waved her over, the perfect faculty wife welcoming everyone into our celebration. She hesitated, her expression unreadable, before making her way to a table at the periphery. Richard clinked his glass then, calling for attention, and I moved to stand beside Emma, my hand resting protectively on her shoulder. I expected Richard's usual eloquence. He had always been a gifted public speaker, able to charm any audience with his warm humor and thoughtful observations. I anticipated a father's loving tribute to his daughter, perhaps with a self-deprecating joke about how she had surpassed him already. The first few sentences followed this expected script. He praised Emma's intellect, her determination, her bright future. Then his tone shifted, almost imperceptibly at first, becoming more personal, more introspective. He began talking about life's crossroads, about authentic choices, about not settling for comfortable patterns. My smile became fixed, a growing unease spreading through me as he veered away from celebrating Emma. "Life is too short for compromise," he was saying, his gaze now moving past us to fix on something, someone behind us. "Sometimes we must be brave enough to choose happiness, even when that choice disrupts what we've built." It was at that moment, watching confusion spread across our guests' faces, that I realized something was terribly wrong. Emma tensed under my hand, her posture stiffening as she too sensed the conversation taking an inappropriate turn. I turned, slightly, following Richard's gaze to where Veronica stood, her expression a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. And then the words that shattered everything. "Catherine and I have grown apart. Veronica and I have developed a deep connection, and we've decided to begin our life together. Today seems fitting, a day of new beginnings for Emma, and now for me as well." The calculated cruelty of the timing didn't register immediately. That would come later, the realization that he had deliberately chosen our daughter's celebration to make his announcement, ensuring I wouldn't make a scene, using the milestone as a convenient launching pad for his new life. In that moment, there was only the physical sensation of the ground giving way beneath me, of 23 years dissolving into nothing. "Mom," Emma whispered as Martha led me inside, her voice breaking through my shock. "What's happening? Did you know about this?" The raw hurt in her eyes nearly undid me completely. Not only had Richard betrayed me, but he had also wounded our daughter on what should have been her day of triumph. "No, sweetheart," I managed, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "I had no idea." The enormity of his deception was just beginning to settle over me. How long had he been planning this? How many department functions had I attended, smiling beside him, while he and Veronica exchanged knowing glances behind my back? How many faculty wives had suspected, pitied me, whispered about my obliviousness? Our kitchen, normally my domain of comfort and control, felt suddenly alien. The graduation cake I'd specially ordered, "Congratulations, Emma, summa cum laude," seemed to mock me from the counter. The caterers averted their eyes, busying themselves with unnecessary rearrangements of serving platters, clearly uncomfortable witnesses to our family's implosion. "I'll take care of the guests," Martha said decisively, squeezing my arm. "You, too, take some time." She glanced toward the patio, where confused murmurs had replaced the festive atmosphere. "Mark is dealing with Richard." The way she said his name, like something distasteful, was the first indication of how quickly loyalty lines were being drawn. Emma paced the kitchen, her graduation cap now crushed in her hands. How could he do this? Today of all days? It's so calculated. Her academic mind was already analyzing what my heart couldn't yet process. He made sure you wouldn't cause a scene. He used my graduation as a shield for his announcement. The kitchen door swung open, and Richard entered, his expression a strange mixture of defiance and discomfort. Mark hovered behind him, clearly there to intervene if necessary. "I need to get some things," Richard said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Veronica's waiting." "Veronica's waiting?" Emma repeated incredulously. "Did you just say that to Mom? At my graduation party that she spent weeks planning?" She stepped between us, her slender frame vibrating with fury. "You don't get to walk in here like nothing's happened. You don't get to ruin today and then just collect your things like you're leaving for a business trip." Richard had the grace to look momentarily ashamed before his expression hardened. "I never meant to hurt either of you. This isn't about you, Emma, and it isn't really about your mother either. Veronica and I—" "Stop saying her name in our house," I interrupted, finding my voice at last. The shock was beginning to crystallize into something sharper, more defined. "You don't get to stand in the kitchen I've cooked your meals in for 23 years and talk about your girlfriend." "Catherine," he sighed, with the same patronizing tone he used when explaining why I couldn't possibly understand certain economic theories. "I know this is difficult, but we need to be adults about this. I've already spoken with Bradley." Bradley. Cohen, his department colleague and apparently his lawyer. "We can handle this civilly." Civilly? The word seemed to trigger something in me, perhaps because civility had been my religion throughout our marriage. Always the gracious faculty wife, never raising my voice, never showing anger, maintaining perfect composure regardless of the provocation. Was it civil to humiliate me in front of our friends and colleagues? Was it civil to ruin Emma's graduation celebration? Is there something civil about having an affair with your secretary while I edited your papers and hosted your department events? Richard's eyes widened slightly. In 23 years of marriage, he had rarely seen me truly angry. I had been raised to believe that anger was unbecoming, that a lady, especially a faculty wife, maintained composure at all costs. My parents' marriage had operated on similar principles. My father made pronouncements, and my mother accommodated. I had followed that template, believing it was the foundation of a successful partnership. "I'm sorry about the timing," he said finally, though his tone suggested more irritation than remorse. "That was Impulsive. But Veronica and I haven't been sneaking around. This is a genuine connection that developed naturally. We've been trying to be respectful about it. Respectful? Emma laughed bitterly. Is that what you call making your announcement at my graduation party? Is that what you call leaving mom for someone younger than your own daughter? Veronica is 34, Richard corrected stiffly, as though this detail somehow improved the situation. And this isn't about age. It's about intellectual compatibility, about shared goals and interests. His words struck like physical blows. How many times had he described us the same way in the early years of our marriage? Martha slipped back into the kitchen. Most of the guests are leaving, she reported quietly. The caterers want to know if they should pack everything up. The practical questions somehow highlighted the surreal quality of the moment, discussing leftover canapes while my marriage disintegrated before my eyes. Yes, tell them to pack it up, I said automatically. Years of hostess habits impossible, to break even now. Ask them to leave everything in the refrigerator. Then, a thought occurred to me. Actually, have them deliver it all to the graduate student lounge. No sense wasting good food. Richard watched this exchange with a strange expression, almost surprise, as though he hadn't expected me to still function effectively. Did he think I would collapse without him? That I would be incapable of managing such basic decisions? I need to collect some clothes and my laptop, he said, gesturing toward the stairs. I'll be quick. Your laptop is in your study, I replied, mechanically. Your clothes can wait until tomorrow. I'd like you to leave now. The steadiness in my voice surprised me. Inside, I felt as though I were shattering into 1,000 pieces, but externally, some survival mechanism had taken over, guiding me through these uncharted waters. Richard hesitated, clearly unused to direct opposition from me. Our marriage had operated on my accommodation of his needs, my anticipation of his preferences, my absorption of his moods. Now, seeing me set a boundary, however small, seemed to confuse him. Catherine, be reasonable. I need my things. And I needed a husband who wouldn't betray me in front of everyone we know, I countered, my voice rising slightly. I needed a father who wouldn't ruin his daughter's graduation. We don't always get what we need, do we, Richard? Mark stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Richard's shoulder. You heard, Catherine. Your things will be here tomorrow. I'll help. You get your laptop from the study and then we're leaving. His tone left no room for argument. Richard and Mark had been friends since graduate school, racquetball partners, academic collaborators. Now Mark was choosing sides, and the significance wasn't lost on any of us. Richard's face tightened with anger, the familiar expression I'd seen when junior faculty challenged his academic opinions, or when department politics didn't go his way. For a moment, I thought he might argue, but something in my stance, or in Emma's protective positioning beside me, made him reconsider. Fine, he said tersely. I'll collect some essentials with Mark, and we'll discuss the rest tomorrow when everyone's calmer. He addressed this last part to me with the condescending tone he used for emotionally overwrought students. The implication was clear. My reaction was excessive, irrational, temporary. By tomorrow, I would return to my familiar, accommodating self, ready to facilitate his transition to his new life, as I had facilitated everything else. As Mark led Richard toward his study, Emma slipped her hand into mine. Her fingers were ice cold. Where will he go? She asked quietly, the fury in her voice now tempered with confusion. To her, I suppose, I replied, the reality of the situation still not fully penetrating my shock. Veronica had an apartment in the newer faculty housing complex across campus. I had helped her find it when she first joined the department, even recommended the leasing office to her. Had they been meeting there all along? Had she welcomed Richard into a space I had helped her secure? The front door closed with a decisive click as Mark escorted Richard out. Through the kitchen window, I could see the remaining guests awkwardly making their way to their cars, some glancing back at the house with undisguised curiosity. Tomorrow, this would be all over campus. By Monday, it would have reached the provost's office and the university president. The humiliation would be complete. "I'm so sorry, Mom," Emma whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "He ruined everything." I pulled her into my arms, my maternal instinct to protect overriding my own pain. "No, he didn't ruin everything," I said fiercely. "He couldn't possibly ruin everything because he isn't everything. He's just one person who made a terrible choice." The words came from somewhere beyond my conscious thought, a truth I needed to believe as much as Emma did. Martha returned to the kitchen, having overseen. "The caterer's packing. The guests are gone," she reported, her normally cheerful face drawn with concern. "Mark is making sure Richard leaves. What can I do, Kath?" What could anyone do? My marriage was over. My identity as Richard's wife, the foundation around which I had structured my entire adult life, had been stripped away in front of everyone who mattered in our social world. The future I had imagined, Richard's eventual retirement, travel together, grandchildren, had evaporated in an instant. "I don't know," I admitted, my composure finally beginning to crack. "I don't know what happens now." Martha pulled out a kitchen chair. "First, you sit down. I'm going to make tea, the proper kind, not that herbal stuff you keep for department functions." She moved efficiently around my kitchen, filling the kettle, finding the loose tea I reserved for personal crises. It struck me as absurd that making tea was her first response to catastrophe, but also oddly comforting in its familiarity. Emma sat beside me, removing her graduation gown which she had kept on throughout the party. The symbolic timing wasn't lost on me. Her emergence into adulthood coinciding with the collapse of the family structure she had known her entire life. She folded the gown with careful precision, smoothing the fabric as though this small act of order could somehow counterbalance the chaos erupting around us. "Did you really not know?" she asked quietly, her eyes fixed on the gown rather than on my face. Were there signs I missed too? The question cut deeper than Richard's betrayal. Had I been so willfully blind? So desperate to maintain our perfect academic family that I had ignored evidence of its hollowness? I thought back over the past months, searching for overlooked clues. Richard's increased time at the office, the conferences he suddenly couldn't miss, the password on his phone, the new clothes, the distracted responses to my questions about departmental matters that I'd previously been fully informed about. There were signs, I admitted, both to Emma and to myself. I just didn't want to see them. Or maybe I didn't know how to interpret them because I couldn't imagine he would actually do this. The admission felt like a failure, not just as a wife, but as an intelligent woman. I had built my identity around being observant, perceptive, attuned to the subtle currents of academic politics. How had I missed the unraveling of my own marriage? Martha placed steaming mugs before us, the strong black tea releasing its comforting aroma. "Don't do that to yourself, Kath," she said firmly. "Richard is an accomplished liar. He's spent his career convincing people of his intellectual authority. He applied those same skills to deceiving you." Her bluntness was startling, but somehow steadying. "Did you know?" I couldn't help asking. "Did others suspect?" Martha hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "There were rumors," she acknowledged, "but nothing concrete until recently. I intended to talk to you after graduation. I never imagined he would pull something like this today." The knowledge that others had suspected, had whispered about us, while I remained oblivious, added a new dimension to the humiliation. I had prided myself on being respected within the university community, on maintaining a dignified presence as Richard's partner. Now I would be the subject of pity, of gossip, of departmental drama, the faculty wife who couldn't keep her husband's interest, who was replaced by a younger model who didn't see it coming. "What happens now?" Emma asked again, echoing my own unspoken question. Her face, so like Richard's in its intellectual intensity but with my more emotional eyes, looked suddenly young and uncertain. "Now," I said, gathering strength from some reserve I didn't know I possessed. "We get through tonight. Tomorrow we'll start figuring out the rest." It was the most honest answer I could give. For someone who had planned dinner menus weeks in advance and organized departmental events with military precision, the absence of a clear path forward was terrifying. But pretending I had answers would only compound the betrayal Emma had already experienced. That first night was the longest of my life. After Martha finally left, with promises to return in the morning, and Emma had fallen into exhausted sleep in her childhood bedroom, I found myself wandering through the silent house like a ghost. Every room held memories of the life I thought we'd built together. Richard's books mingled with mine on the living room shelves, our wedding photo still displayed on the piano, his reading glasses abandoned on the side table beside his favorite chair. The material evidence of our partnership remained intact, while the emotional foundation had crumbled completely. I couldn't bear to enter our bedroom, with its king-sized bed where we'd slept side by side for decades. Instead, I curled up on the sofa in my study, surrounded by the art history books that had once defined my academic ambitions before I'd redirected that energy towards supporting Richard's career. Dawn found me still awake, staring at the ceiling, mentally cataloging the practical problems I would need to address: financial accounts, health insurance, the mortgage on our home, the summer faculty events I had already committed to hosting. Emma found me there as morning light filtered through the windows. She looked as though she hadn't slept much better than I had, her eyes shadowed, her movements careful as though she might shatter something with a careless gesture. "I made coffee," she said, offering me a steaming mug, "and I called Aunt Judith." My sister Judith lived 3 hours away in the state capital. Unlike me, she had maintained her career as an attorney while raising her children, balancing family and professional ambitions with a determination I had always secretly envied. Where I had been accommodating, Judith had been assertive. Where I had compromised, she had persisted. Her marriage to Thomas, an architect who had adjusted his career to support hers, stood in stark contrast to my more traditional arrangement with Richard. "Good," I said, taking the coffee gratefully. "She'll know what to do about the legal aspects." The pragmatic consideration of legal counsel felt surreal. 24 hours ago, I had been arranging flowers for a graduation celebration, secure in what I thought was a stable, if imperfect, marriage. "She's driving down today," Emma continued, sitting beside me on the sofa. "She was angry about what Dad did. Really angry." There was a note of satisfaction in her voice, as though Judith's anger validated her own feelings. I nodded, oddly, comforted by my sister's predictable response. Judith had never entirely approved of my choices, particularly my decision to set aside my career for Richard's. She had warned me, in her direct way, that sacrificing my professional identity would create an imbalance in our relationship. "Men don't value what comes too easily," she had told me when I declined the assistant curator position at the Metropolitan Museum to stay in Westlake with Richard. "They respect partners, not appendages." Her words had stung at the time, and I had dismissed them as projecting her own ambitious nature onto my more traditional aspirations. Now they returned with prophetic weight. Had I made myself dispensable by being so indispensable in the ways Richard had defined as valuable? Had my accommodation of his every need paradoxically diminished my worth in his eyes? The doorbell interrupted these painful reflections. Emma tensed beside me, clearly fearing Richard's return. "It's probably Martha," I reassured her, though I made no move to answer it. The thought of facing anyone, even my closest friend, felt overwhelming. Emma rose and went to the door. I heard the murmur of voices, then footsteps approaching my study. Martha appeared, bearing a bakery box and a determined expression. Behind her came Mark, looking uncomfortable but resolute. "We brought breakfast," Martha announced, setting the box on my desk. "And Mark has information you should hear." Mark shifted awkwardly, his academic's discomfort with emotional situations evident in his rigid posture. He and his wife had been among our closest friends since Richard and I first arrived at Westlake. Our children had grown up together. We'd vacationed at each other's family lake houses, celebrated tenure decisions and departmental victories as a unit. Now he stood in my study like a stranger, bearing news about my husband that I apparently needed to hear from someone other than Richard himself. "Richard called me this morning," he began, his historian's precision making the personal disclosure sound almost like an academic report. "He wanted me to tell you that he's taking a leave of absence from the department for the remainder of the term. He's recommended Veronica for promotion to administrative director, which would move her out of her secretarial role." He paused, watching my face carefully. He also mentioned that he's been offered a visiting professorship at Stanford for the fall semester. He and Veronica plan to relocate to California. The information hit me in waves of escalating betrayal. A leave of absence, abandoning his responsibilities just as he had abandoned his family. Promoting Veronica, using his position to reward her personally and professionally. Stanford, 3,000 miles away from the mess he'd created. Each revelation highlighted the calculated nature of his decisions. This wasn't an impulsive affair, it was a comprehensive exit strategy. "When was he offered the Stanford position?" I asked, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. Academic appointments, especially prestigious visiting professorships, took months to arrange. The timeline would reveal just how long Richard had been planning his escape. Mark hesitated, confirming my suspicions before he even spoke. "He applied in January," he finally admitted. "The offer came through in March." January. While I was ordering Emma's graduation announcements and planning the spring faculty mixer, March. When Richard and I had discussed renovating the master bathroom, a project that would take months to complete, and that he had enthusiastically supported. The layers of deception were breathtaking in their comprehensiveness. Did everyone know except me? The question escaped before I could censor it, revealing the insecurity that lurked beneath my shock. Had I been the only one not privy to my husband's plans? The only one naive enough to believe in our partnership? "No," Mark said firmly. "He told me about Stanford 2 weeks ago, claimed it was a sudden opportunity. I had no idea about Veronica until yesterday." He ran a hand through his thinning hair, an anxious gesture I'd observed during particularly stressful faculty meetings. "Catherine, the department is in an uproar. The dean called an emergency meeting for tomorrow. Richard's actions have created significant ethical concerns beyond the personal betrayal." The mention of the department's reaction reminded me of my very public humiliation. By now, everyone in our academic circle would know. The story would have spread through faculty text chains, hurried phone calls, perhaps even emails with subject lines like, "Did you hear what happened at the Walsh graduation party?" My carefully maintained reputation as the dignified faculty wife, the gracious department hostess, had been shattered alongside my marriage. "What ethical concerns?" Emma asked, her academic mind focusing on the professional dimensions while I was still struggling with the personal implications. "Department chairs can't have romantic relationships with staff they supervise," Mark explained. "It violates university policy. If Richard was involved with Veronica while serving as her direct supervisor, it creates liability issues for the university, especially if he used his position to benefit her professionally." He glanced at me apologetically, as though delivering, "This administrative analysis of my husband's betrayal might somehow compound my pain. So he'll be professionally embarrassed as well as personally disgraced," Martha observed with obvious satisfaction. She had never particularly liked Richard. I realized suddenly. She had tolerated him for my sake, performed the expected social niceties at departmental functions, but had always maintained a certain reserve around him that I had attributed to their different disciplines. Now her true feelings emerged without filter. Couldn't happen to a more deserving person. "Martha," I murmured, instinctively defending the man who had just humiliated me publicly. The habit of protecting Richard, of smoothing over social awkwardness on his behalf, was apparently too ingrained to discard overnight. She turned to me with uncharacteristic fierceness. "Don't you dare defend him, Catherine. Not now. Not after what he did to you and Emma." Her loyalty was both touching and disorienting. I wasn't accustomed to people being angry on my behalf. In our marriage, I had been the emotional regulator, the one who absorbed tensions and maintained harmony. Having others express outrage that I hadn't yet fully allowed myself to feel was unexpectedly overwhelming. The doorbell rang again, saving me from having to respond. This time it was Richard, flanked by a woman I recognized as his department colleague Bradley Cohen's wife, Susan, an attorney specializing in family law. So it had already progressed to lawyers. The speed of his practical arrangements stood in stark contrast to my emotional paralysis. "I've come for my things," Richard announced without preamble when Emma opened the door, his tone suggesting this was a routine errand rather than the dismantling of our shared life. "Susan has kindly offered to help mediate our initial separation of property." Emma stepped back, allowing them to enter but making no effort to hide her contempt. "How considerate of you to bring legal representation before Mom has had time to find her own," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Very ethical, Dad. Very fair." Susan at least had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I'm just here as a friend," she clarified, though her designer briefcase suggested otherwise. "To help keep things civil." The word civil again, as though the primary concern was maintaining polite appearances rather than addressing the profound violation of trust that had occurred. The academic community's obsession with decorum, with handling even the messiest human failures with detached professionalism, suddenly seemed absurd. "How thoughtful," I said, finding my voice at last. "But I'm afraid this isn't a convenient time. My sister Judith will be arriving shortly. She's an attorney with Hargrove, Bennett, and Schmidt." The name of the prestigious law firm slipped from my lips without conscious thought, a deployment of Judith's professional credentials as a shield against Richard's presumption. "I'll need to consult with her before any discussion of property division." Richard's expression tightened. He had never gotten along with Judith, finding her directness abrasive and her feminist perspectives challenging. The knowledge that she would be representing my interests clearly disrupted his carefully orchestrated plan. "There's no need to turn this into an adversarial process, Catherine," he said, adopting the reasonable tone he used when persuading resistant faculty members to support his initiatives. "We can handle this like adults." "Like you handled telling me about your affair?" The words emerged with unexpected heat. "Like you handled announcing your betrayal at our daughter's graduation party? That kind of adult behavior?" Susan shifted, uncomfortably, clearly regretting her involvement in this Sunday morning ambush. "Perhaps Richard could just collect some personal essentials today," she suggested diplomatically. "The more detailed division of property can wait until both parties have proper representation." Before I could respond, Martha stepped forward. "I'll accompany Richard while he gathers his immediate necessities," she volunteered, her tone making it clear this was non-negotiable. "Susan, perhaps you could wait in the living room. Emma, why don't you show her where the coffee is?" The efficiency with which Martha took control of the situation reminded me of how she managed department meetings, with a velvet-gloved authority that somehow made her directions seem like a collective decision. Emma, recognizing the strategic separation of Richard from his impromptu legal counsel, nodded and gestured for Susan to follow her toward the kitchen. 15 minutes, Martha said to Richard, her voice pleasant but firm. "Just the essentials. Anything else can be arranged later through proper channels." As they disappeared upstairs, Mark quietly approached me. "I should go," he said, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating tension. "But Catherine, the department faculty want you to know." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Many of us consider Richard's behavior unacceptable, both personally and professionally. Your friends are still your friends." The simple statement of solidarity nearly undid my fragile composure. Throughout our marriage, Richard had been the primary connection to the academic community, with me operating in his orbit. The implicit assumption, one I had never consciously examined, was that in any split, the faculty relationships would naturally align with him, the actual colleague, rather than with me, the faculty spouse. Mark's assurance suggested a more complex reality. "Thank you," I managed, touching his arm briefly. "That means more than you know." After he left, I found myself alone in the foyer, listening to the muffled sounds of activity throughout the house. Martha supervising Richard upstairs, Emma making strained conversation with Susan in the kitchen. 24 hours ago, this home had been preparing for a celebration. Now it felt like a diplomatic crisis zone, with territorial negotiations and strategic alliances forming around me. The practical implications of Richard's betrayal were beginning to crystallize through the emotional fog. Our finances had always been jointly managed, but Richard had handled the investments, the retirement accounts, the university benefits. I had managed the household budget, the day-to-day expenditures, the social calendar. How much did I actually know about our overall financial situation? What would happen to the health insurance I received through Richard's faculty benefits? Would I need to sell our home, this space I had lovingly restored and maintained for decades? Where would I go? What would I do? Who would I be if not Professor Richard Walsh's wife? The questions multiplied, each spawning new anxieties, until I felt physically unsteady with their weight. I leaned against the wall, forcing myself to breathe deeply, to focus on the immediate moment rather than the terrifying unknowns stretching before me. One step at a time. Get through today. Wait for Judith. Don't make any decisions in this state of shock. The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced Richard's return. He carried a suitcase and his laptop bag, Martha following closely behind, with an expression suggesting she had maintained strict oversight of his packing activities. He paused when he saw me, and for a moment, something like regret flickered across his face. "Kath," he began, using the nickname from our early years. Together, I know the timing was inexcusable. I never meant for it to happen that way. "But you meant for it to happen," I replied quietly. "You planned your exit meticulously, the Stanford position, the arrangements with Veronica. The only miscalculation was your announcement." He didn't deny it. After 23 years together, we had at least reached the point where outright lies were unnecessary. "The Stanford offer created a timeline I hadn't anticipated," he said instead, as though external circumstances had forced his hand rather than his own choices. I had intended a more private conversation. "How considerate," I said, my voice flat. "And when were you planning this private conversation? Before or after I redecorated the master bathroom? Before or after we hosted the department's end-of-year reception next month? Before or after we took that anniversary trip to Provence we've been discussing?" Each planned future event I mentioned landed like a separate indictment. Richard had the decency to look uncomfortable, though whether from genuine remorse or simply from being caught in his elaborate deceptions, I couldn't tell. "I never meant to hurt you," he offered, the inadequacy of the statement hanging in the air between us. "And yet you made choices guaranteed to cause maximum pain," I observed, surprising myself with the clarity emerging through my emotional fog. "You didn't just have an affair, Richard. You didn't just leave. You orchestrated a public humiliation at an event I spent weeks planning to celebrate our daughter's achievement. You turned what should have been one of the proudest days of my life as a mother into a spectacle that will be gossiped about on campus for years. Susan emerged from the kitchen, Emma trailing behind her with an expression of barely contained fury. "Richard, we should go," Susan suggested, clearly eager to extract herself from the increasingly tense situation. "We can address the division of assets once everyone has had time to process the immediate emotional impact." "Of course," Richard agreed quickly, relieved by the intervention. He turned to Emma, his expression softening. "I'm sorry about yesterday, sweetheart. I'm still your father, and I'm still incredibly proud of your accomplishments. This situation between your mother and me doesn't change how I feel about you." Emma's response cut through his practiced sincerity. "But it changes how I feel about you," she said simply. "You didn't just betray Mom. You betrayed our whole family, everything we thought we were." Richard flinched as though she had struck him physically. For a moment, he seemed about to argue, to defend himself, but something in Emma's unwavering gaze stopped him. Instead, he nodded stiffly, picked up his suitcase, and followed Susan toward the door. "I'll be in touch," he said to me, pausing at the threshold. "There are financial matters we need to discuss." "Through my attorney," I replied, drawing on some reserve of strength I hadn't known I possessed. "All communication through attorneys from this point forward." After they left, the house felt both emptier and somehow less suffocating. Martha put her arm around my shoulders, offering silent support as we stood in the foyer that still displayed family photographs from happier times, Emma's high school graduation, our 20th anniversary trip to Italy, the department holiday party where Richard had received the Distinguished Faculty Award. "What happens now?" Emma asked, echoing the question that had become our refrain since yesterday's implosion. Before I could formulate a response, the doorbell rang yet again. This time it was Judith, her arrival announcing itself with characteristic decisiveness. My sister had always been a force of nature, brilliant, direct, and fiercely protective of those she loved. She swept into the house trailing the scent of expensive perfume and carrying both a designer overnight bag and a leather portfolio that suggested she had come prepared for battle. "Where is he?" she demanded without preamble, setting down her bags and scanning the foyer as though expecting to find Richard hiding behind the furniture. "Tell me he's not still here." "He just left," I said, accepting her fierce hug. "With his lawyer." Judith pulled back, her expression sharpening. "He brought a lawyer already? Who?" "Susan Cohen, Bradley's wife." The academic connections were so incestuous, I realized. Everyone linked to everyone else through departmental relationships, professional collaborations, and social networks that had evolved over decades. "Family law?" Judith asked, her mind immediately categorizing the threat. "Level, yes. Aggressive or conciliatory?" She presented it as friendly mediation, but she had her briefcase and legal pad ready. Judith nodded, absorbing this information with professional calculation. "Classic ambush tactic. They hope to catch you vulnerable and without representation." She turned to Emma, softening momentarily to embrace my daughter. "I'm so sorry about your graduation celebration, sweetheart. What your father did was unconscionable." Emma returned the hug, some of the tension visibly leaving her shoulders in her aunt's capable presence. Judith had always been Emma's role. Model, the working mother who seemed to effortlessly balance career ambitions with family responsibilities, who wore her success with unapologetic confidence. Can Mom actually get what she deserves after dedicating her entire adult life to supporting him? Emma asked bluntly, articulating the question I hadn't yet allowed myself to fully consider. Judith guided us into the living room, her purposeful movement suggesting that proper discussions required proper settings. Martha followed, positioning herself slightly apart as though uncertain whether this family conference included her. "Absolutely she can," Judith stated with professional conviction as we settled onto the sofas. Catherine sacrificed her own career trajectory to support Richard's. She managed his household, facilitated his professional advancement, raised his child, and contributed substantially to his success. Under equitable distribution principles, she's entitled to a significant portion of all marital assets, including his pension and any intellectual property developed during the marriage. The legal terminology felt surreal applied to my own life: equitable distribution, marital assets, intellectual property. These were concepts I understood abstractly, but had never imagined would define the dissolution of my marriage. The academic articles Richard had published with my editorial assistance, the department grant proposals I had helped refine, the textbook he had written at our dining room table while I managed the household around his schedule, all potentially divisible, assets in the cold calculus of divorce. Richard mentioned a Stanford position beginning in the fall, I said, still struggling to organize the fragments of information into a coherent picture. He apparently applied in January and received the offer in March. Judith's expression darkened. So he's been planning this for months, while actively concealing his intentions from you. She made a note in the leather portfolio she had extracted from her bag. That's relevant to negotiations. Evidence of deception and premeditated financial maneuvering. Martha spoke up from her position by the fireplace. Richard also recommended Veronica for promotion to administrative director just as he's taking a leave of absence. Mark says the timing and circumstances raise serious ethical concerns for the university. Judith's eyebrows rose with predatory interest. Abuse of power, professional ethics violations, potential university liability, excellent leverage points. She spoke with the clinical detachment of a strategist assessing battlefield advantages, transforming my personal catastrophe into a legal case with tactical considerations. Part of me recoiled from this calculating approach to the end of my marriage. For 23 years, I had operated on principles of compromise, accommodation, and avoiding conflict. Judith's adversarial framing felt foreign, almost distasteful. But another part recognized the necessity of her perspective. Richard had abandoned any pretense of fairness or consideration. Navigating the aftermath of his betrayal would require a matching pragmatism. I don't want to destroy him, I said quietly, the admission feeling like a weakness even as I voiced it. I just want what's fair. Judith set down her pen and took my hands in hers, her expression softening from professional strategist to concerned. Sister, Catherine, listen to me carefully. The greatest mistake women make in divorce is confusing fairness with generosity. Richard hasn't played fair. He has calculated his moves to maximize his advantage while minimizing his obligations. We must be equally strategic, not out of vengeance, but out of self-protection. The weeks that followed took on a surreal quality, as though I were watching someone else's life unravel from a distance. Judith stayed for 3 days, setting legal machinery in motion with terrifying efficiency. She connected me with a local attorney from her firm's network, Elaine Winters, a formidable divorce specialist with a reputation for representing faculty spouses in university towns across the state. Elaine arrived at our first meeting with a comprehensive checklist of financial documents I needed to locate and a blunt assessment of what lay ahead. Academic divorces have their own particular challenges, she explained, her no-nonsense demeanor somehow reassuring amid the chaos. The compensation structures are complex: base salary, research grants, summer teaching stipends, consulting fees, book royalties, speaking honoraria. We'll need to trace every income stream and ensure full disclosure. I nodded, trying to appear more competent than I felt. In truth, I had only a vague understanding of Richard's complete financial picture. I managed our household accounts meticulously, but Richard had always handled the investments, retirement planning, and tax matters. This division had seemed natural at the time, an efficient allocation of responsibilities. Now it revealed itself as a critical vulnerability. What about the house? I asked, glancing around the living room where faculty colleagues had gathered for countless dinner parties, where Emma had opened Christmas presents and practiced violin recitals, where I had built a life I thought was permanent. You'll likely have 2 options, Elaine replied, her candor respectful but unsparing. "You can buy out Richard's equity share if you want to keep it, or you can sell and divide the proceeds. Given the current market and your income situation, keeping it may be challenging unless you receive substantial alimony and support." My income situation. The euphemism highlighted the stark reality of my position. After 2 decades of part-time work arranged around Richard's career and Emma's activities, my professional identity had atrophied. The museum cataloging position I held provided intellectual satisfaction but minimal financial security. At 51, I faced the prospect of rebuilding a career I had willingly subordinated to my husband's ambitions. "What about health insurance?" I asked, voicing the practical concern that had kept me awake during those first turbulent nights. "I'm covered through Richard's faculty benefits. We'll negotiate continued coverage through the university plan as part of the settlement," Elaine assured me. Faculty benefits typically include provisions for ex-spouses, especially in long-term marriages, with significant support contributions from the non-faculty partner. Throughout these practical discussions, Emma moved through the house like a silent guardian, her planned post-graduation European trip abandoned in favor of staying close to home. She attended appointments with financial advisors, sat through meetings with realtors evaluating our property, and compiled documents from Richard's home office with methodical precision. Her academic mind, so like her father's in its analytical capability but tempered with my emotional intelligence, processed the dismantling of our family life as though it were a complex research project. "You don't need to put your life on hold for this," I told her one evening as we sorted through decades of financial records in Richard's study. "Your program starts in September. You should still take that trip to Italy you've been planning." She looked up from a stack of investment statements, her expression far too serious for someone just weeks past her college graduation. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she said simply. "Besides, I'm learning more about real-world economics from this disaster than any summer internship could teach me." Her resilience both comforted and concerned me. Children shouldn't have to witness their parents' failures so starkly, shouldn't have to help pick up the pieces of a broken marriage. Yet Emma's involvement seemed to provide her with some sense of agency amid circumstances beyond her control. By helping reconstruct our financial history, she was reclaiming narrative control over the family collapse her father had orchestrated. The practical realities of separation unfolded alongside a different kind of dissolution, the unraveling of my social identity within the university community. For more than 2 decades, I had been Catherine Walsh, Richard's wife, a designation that had opened doors, shaped interactions, and defined my place within the academic hierarchy. Now that identity was simultaneously shattered and amplified, I was still Catherine Walsh, but recontextualized as the abandoned spouse, the subject of whispered conversations and awkward encounters. The first such encounter came just days after Richard's announcement when I ventured to the campus coffee shop to meet with Elaine. I spotted Patricia Hendricks, wife of the university president, before she saw me. For a moment, I considered retreating, avoiding the inevitable, uncomfortable exchange. But Patricia's gaze found mine, and retreat became impossible. "Catherine," she said, approaching my table with the carefully calibrated concern of someone addressing the recently bereaved. "How are you holding up? Such a difficult time." "I'm managing," I replied, summoning the poised faculty wife persona that had become second nature over the years, "taking things one day at a time." Patricia nodded sympathetically, her perfectly highlighted hair bouncing with the movement. "The university community is here for you," she offered, the assurance sounding more institutional than personal. "Richard's behavior has been—" She paused, searching for appropriately diplomatic terminology. "Professionally disappointing. President Hendricks is quite concerned about the department leadership situation." The subtext was clear. Richard's affair, with his secretary, created administrative headaches beyond the personal betrayal. The university's concern was for institutional stability, not my emotional well-being. I had been part of the university machine for so long that I understood this calculus perfectly, though it struck me now as coldly bureaucratic. Please don't worry about me causing any additional complications, I said, unable to entirely suppress the edge in my voice. I'll be appropriately discreet throughout the proceedings. The university's reputation remains safe. Patricia flushed slightly, recognizing the subtle rebuke in my response. Catherine, that's not what she began, but was interrupted by the arrival of Elaine, whose professional demeanor immediately transformed the dynamic. Mrs. Hendricks, Elaine greeted her with polite efficiency. I'm afraid Catherine and I have legal matters to discuss. Perhaps you could continue your conversation another time. As Patricia retreated with murmured good wishes, Elaine sat across from me with an approving nod. Well handled. The university administrators will try to frame this as an unfortunate personal matter while minimizing the professional ethics violations. Don't let them. I've spent my entire adult life protecting the university's image, I admitted, the realization emerging as I spoke it. Hosting donors, charming visiting scholars, smoothing over departmental tensions at dinner parties, all to maintain the polished facade of academic excellence. And now? Elaine prompted, her experienced eyes assessing my emotional state with professional precision. I considered the question seriously. The instinct to preserve institutional harmony remained strong. Decades of socialization as a faculty, spouse didn't disappear overnight. But alongside it grew a new awareness of how that institutional structure had failed to value my contributions or protect my interests. Now I need to prioritize my own well-being, I said finally. The university has plenty of defenders. I need to be mine. This resolution was tested repeatedly in the weeks that followed, as I navigated a community where Richard and I had been fixtures for decades. The farmer's market where I'd shopped every Saturday morning became a gauntlet of sympathetic glances and hastily interrupted conversations. The library reading room where I'd conducted research for my cataloging work now felt exposed, vulnerable to unexpected encounters with Richard's colleagues or students. Even the walking path around the campus lake, once my favorite refuge for quiet contemplation, became fraught with potential awkwardness. Gradually, I developed coping strategies. I identified the safest times to conduct necessary errands, mapped mental routes through campus that minimized exposure to academic buildings where Richard's presence might linger, and cultivated a select circle of trusted confidants who offered genuine support rather than academic gossip disguised as concern. Martha proved invaluable in this navigation, her decades of experience as a faculty member making her uniquely positioned to understand both the official and unofficial university structures affecting my situation. You need to get involved in something completely separate from the university, Martha suggested over lunch at a small cafe deliberately chosen for its distance from campus. Something that has nothing to do with Richard or academia or any of the social circles you've been navigating for the past 20 years. I stirred my tea absently, considering her advice. The idea of voluntarily adding another commitment to my already overwhelming situation seemed daunting, yet I recognized the wisdom in her suggestion. My entire identity had been constructed around my role as Richard's wife and Emma's mother. With Emma preparing to start graduate school in September and Richard extracted from my daily life, the contours of that identity had blurred, leaving me unmoored. I wouldn't even know where to begin, I admitted. Everything in this town is connected to the university somehow. Martha's expression turned thoughtful. What about the art restoration project at the Historical Society? They're working on those WPA murals from the old post office building. Given your background in art history, you might actually be able to contribute something meaningful. Suggestion sparked an unexpected flicker of interest. Before marriage, before Richard, before the gradual subordination of my professional ambitions to his career, I had specialized in New Deal public art programs. My master's thesis had examined the intersections of art, economics, and public policy during the Depression. a topic that had initially connected Richard and me during that first museum consultation. "The Murray Building murals?" I asked, memories of my earlier academic life resurfacing. "I didn't realize they were being restored." "The Historical Society received a state humanities grant," Martha explained. "They're looking for volunteers with relevant expertise. It might be good for you to reconnect with your original academic interests." The conversation shifted to other topics, but the idea lingered. That evening, I found myself searching for information about the restoration project online, reading about the conservation challenges posed by the mural's exposure to decades of cigarette smoke and poor climate control. Almost without conscious decision, I sent an inquiry about volunteer opportunities. My first tentative step toward reclaiming some fragment of the professional identity I had set aside for Richard's benefit. The Historical Society director, Eleanor Jenkins, responded with almost alarming enthusiasm when I mentioned my academic background. "We've been hoping to find someone with formal training in art history," she explained during our initial meeting in the Society's modest offices downtown. "Most of our volunteers are well-intentioned, but lack specialized knowledge about Depression-era public art programs." As she led me through the building to where the removed mural panels were being carefully cleaned, I felt a strange sensation, like encountering a younger version of myself, the ambitious graduate student whose intellectual passion had been sidelined but never fully extinguished. The massive canvases depicting local agricultural and industrial scenes, their colors dulled by decades of neglect but their artistic merit still evident, awakened something I had long suppressed. "The conservation team visits monthly," Eleanor explained. "But we need someone with knowledge to help document the historical context, prepare educational materials, and eventually develop the exhibition space once the panels are restored." "I could help with that," I heard myself offering, surprised by my own decisiveness. "I specialized in New Deal art programs before." I stopped, unsure how to complete the sentence without referencing my marriage. Before Richard, before I became primarily his wife rather than my own person. Eleanor didn't seem to notice my hesitation. "Wonderful. We meet on Wednesday afternoons and Saturday mornings. Would either of those work for your schedule?" "My schedule." The phrase highlighted how dramatically my life had changed. For decades, my schedule had been constructed around Richard's teaching commitments, department meetings, and research priorities. Even my part-time work at the University Museum had been carefully arranged to ensure I remained available when Richard needed me. To host impromptu dinners for visiting scholars, to attend faculty functions as his +1, to create the seamless, domestic support that facilitated his professional success. "Both," I said, making a decision that felt simultaneously small and momentous. "I can commit to both sessions for the duration of the project." The restoration project became an unexpected lifeline over the following weeks, providing structure and purpose during a period when the rest of my life seemed to be disintegrating into legal meetings and financial assessments. The work itself was absorbing, researching the original commission documents in the Historical Society archives, interviewing elderly residents who remembered the murals in their original location, drafting educational materials that contextualized the artwork within both local history and broader national art movements. More importantly, the project connected me with people entirely outside the university orbit. Eleanor, a retired high school history teacher with a passion for local heritage. Jackson, the Society's meticulous archivist who approached historical documents with reverence bordering on religious devotion. Meredith, a retired nurse whose father had worked on the original building construction and who possessed a trove of family photographs documenting the mural installation. These people knew nothing of my humiliation at Emma's graduation party, cared nothing about departmental politics or academic hierarchies. They valued me for my knowledge and contributions, not for my relationship to a prestigious faculty member. "You seem different when you talk about the murals," Emma observed one evening after I'd spent dinner enthusiastically describing a newly discovered letter from the original artist to his patron. "More like yourself, somehow." Her comment caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" Emma considered her response carefully, displaying the thoughtfulness that had always distinguished her from her more impulsive peers. "All my life, I've watched you organize yourself around Dad's needs and schedule. Even your conversations at dinner parties. You'd start to discuss something you found interesting, then defer to Dad when he wanted to steer the topic elsewhere." She traced the rim of her water glass, not meeting my eyes. "The way you talk about this project, you don't look for external validation before expressing your opinions. You just share what you think because you think it." Her perception startled me with its accuracy. Had I really become so habituated to seeking Richard's approval that my own daughter had noticed? Had my intellectual deference become so ingrained that its absence was remarkable? "The Historical Society people treat you differently too," Emma continued. "When I picked you up last Wednesday, they were asking you questions, actually listening to your answers, not just being polite while waiting to talk to Dad." The observation stung with its truth. Within Richard's academic circle, I had been respected primarily as an extension of him, the department chair's capable wife, the faculty hostess known for thoughtful dinner pairings and skillful conversation management. My occasional intellectual contributions were received with polite acknowledgement rather than genuine engagement. I had become so accustomed to this dynamic that I'd stopped noticing its subtle diminishment. "I think I stopped believing I had anything valuable to contribute," I admitted, the realization forming as I spoke it. Somewhere along the way, I internalized the idea that my thoughts were less significant than Richard's. Emma reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Dad has that effect on people," she said with unexpected insight. "He fills rooms with his certainty. It doesn't leave much space for anyone else's ideas." After a pause, she added quietly, "I've been thinking a lot about how I don't want my relationships to be like that." The comment revealed dimensions of awareness I hadn't realized Emma possessed, not just about her parents' marriage, but about how its patterns might influence her own future choices. While I had been worried about the impact of Richard's betrayal on her, she had been observing, analyzing, determining which aspects of our family dynamic she wanted to replicate in her own life, and which she would consciously reject. "When did you get so wise?" I asked, both proud of and slightly unnerved by her maturity. "I had good teachers," she replied with a small smile, "just not always in the ways they intended." This conversation with Emma coincided with another significant development in the dismantling of my marriage. Elaine called to inform me that the University Ethics Committee had completed its preliminary review of Richard's relationship with Veronica. The findings were unambiguous. Richard had violated multiple university policies regarding supervisor-subordinate relationships, failure to disclose conflicts of interest, and abuse of power in recommending her promotion while concealing their personal involvement. "The committee has recommended disciplinary action," Elaine reported with professional satisfaction. "Richard has been removed as department chair effective immediately, and Veronica's promotion has been rescinded pending further review." More importantly for our purposes, this official finding strengthens our position in settlement negotiations. The university is concerned about potential liability, which gives us significant leverage. The news should have felt vindicating. After months of humiliation and upheaval, there was finally some official acknowledgement that Richard's behavior had been not just personally devastating, but professionally unethical. Yet my reaction surprised me. Alongside the expected satisfaction came an unexpected sadness for the tarnishing of a career Richard had built over decades. Despite everything, some part of me still remembered the brilliant young professor who had encouraged my intellectual growth, who had built an academic reputation through genuine scholarly contributions. "What does this mean for Richard's position at Stanford?" I asked, thinking of the carefully orchestrated exit strategy he had planned with Veronica. "That's the interesting part," Elaine replied. "According to our sources, Stanford has withdrawn the visiting professorship offer. Apparently, they weren't aware of the circumstances surrounding his sudden availability, and they're not interested in importing another university's ethics scandal. The collapse of Richard's carefully constructed escape plan created ripple effects that reached me in unexpected ways. The university grapevine, that informal but remarkably efficient communication network linking administrative assistants, department coordinators, and faculty spouses, delivered updates with almost real-time precision. Richard and Veronica had vacated their apartment near campus. Their planned California relocation had disintegrated along with the Stanford position. They were reportedly staying temporarily with Richard's brother in the city, an hour's drive away, while attempting to salvage what remained of their professional prospects. I received this information not with the satisfaction I might have expected, but with a complex mixture of emotions I couldn't entirely unravel. There was a certain cosmic justice in watching Richard's meticulously planned future unravel due to his own ethical failures. Yet I took no pleasure in his professional humiliation or in Veronica's collateral career damage. What I felt instead was a growing sense of detachment, as though the consequences of Richard's choices were becoming increasingly separate from my own path forward. This detachment was tested when Richard requested a meeting without lawyers present. Just to talk, according to his careful text message. After consulting with Elaine, who advised against it but acknowledged I was free to make my own decisions, I agreed to meet at a neutral location, a cafe in the neighboring town where we were unlikely to encounter university colleagues. Richard was already seated when I arrived. His appearance subtly changed after just 2 months of separation. He had lost weight, and the confident posture that had characterized him throughout our marriage seemed diminished. When he spotted me, he half rose from his chair, an awkward gesture caught between formality and familiarity. "Thank you for coming," he said as I took the seat across from him. "I know you're not obligated to speak with me outside of legal channels." I nodded, waiting. Whatever had prompted this meeting, I wouldn't make it easier by filling the silence with nervous conversation, another habit from our marriage that I was consciously trying to break. Richard fidgeted with his coffee cup, uncharacteristically hesitant. The distinguished department chair who could command faculty meetings with authoritative ease seemed to have vanished, replaced by someone more uncertain, more human. "I wanted to apologize," he finally said, meeting my eyes with what appeared to be genuine contrition. "Not just for the end of our marriage, but for how I handled it. The announcement at Emma's graduation party was inexcusable. You deserved better. Emma deserved better." The apology was unexpected, not because Richard was incapable of acknowledging mistakes, but because his admissions of error had always been carefully qualified, designed to maintain intellectual authority even in moments of concession. This simpler, more direct acknowledgement felt foreign coming from him. "Why did you do it that way?" I asked, the question that had haunted me for months finally finding voice. "You had to know how humiliating it would be, how much it would hurt Emma on her day." Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of genuine distress. "I wish I had a rational explanation. The truth is more pathetic than calculated." He paused, seeming to struggle with his own vulnerability. "I'd been postponing the conversation for weeks. The Stanford offer was finalized. Arrangements with Veronica were made, but I couldn't bring myself to have the actual discussion with you." He stared into his coffee, the brilliant academic reduced to fumbling for words. "Every time I thought about sitting you down and saying it directly, I froze. I told myself it would be better after Emma's graduation, that I didn't want to disrupt her final semester. But really, I was just being a coward." "So what changed at the party?" I pressed, needing to understand the mechanics of his decision, the moment when he chose public declaration over private disclosure. Veronica texted me during the party. She was upset about being excluded from the celebration, felt I was still hiding her away while playing happy family. We argued. I'd had too much champagne, was feeling cornered between her ultimatums and my own procrastination. He shook his head, seemingly aware of how inadequate these explanations sounded. In that moment, making the announcement felt like cutting through an impossible knot. Obviously, it was the worst possible choice. The banality of his explanation was almost more painful than some calculated cruelty would have been. 23 years of marriage, ended not through careful consideration of irreconcilable differences, but through the petty pressure of a girlfriend's text message and too much champagne. Our life together, discarded in a moment of alcohol-fueled conflict resolution. And now? I asked, gesturing vaguely to encompass the current state of affairs. His lost position, the withdrawn Stanford offer, the ethical reprimand on his academic record. Now I'm trying to salvage what I can, he admitted. The university has offered to let me retain my faculty position with certain stipulations: ethics training, removal from any supervisory roles for at least 3 years, probationary status. It's humiliating, but better than being terminated outright. And Veronica? A flicker of discomfort crossed his face. She's resigned from the university. The ethics investigation made her position untenable. He hesitated. She's reconsidering our relationship in light of recent developments. The euphemism was almost comical in its academic blandness. Reconsidering our relationship. The woman who had been worth destroying our family for was now reevaluating her investment in a partner whose professional capital had dramatically depreciated. I felt a surprising absence of satisfaction at this development. No vindictive pleasure, no sense of karmic justice. Just a weary recognition of patterns playing out to their predictable conclusion. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and found that I meant it. Not because I wished their relationship well, but because there was something profoundly sad about the entire situation. Lives disrupted, careers damaged, and potentially nothing of value salvaged from the wreckage. Richard looked surprised by my response, perhaps expecting recrimination rather than empathy. "Catherine, I need to ask, is there any possibility?" he began, then stopped, reconsidering his words. "The house feels empty without you and Emma. My apartment is sterile, impersonal. I miss our life together." The implication hung between us, unspoken but unmistakable. Was reconciliation possible? Could we rebuild from these ruins? For a disorienting moment, I tried to imagine it, returning to our carefully constructed life, resuming my role as Richard's supportive partner, perhaps with some renegotiated terms to acknowledge what had transpired. The mere attempt at visualization revealed its impossibility. That life belonged to someone I no longer was, a woman who had organized her existence around her husband's priorities, who had subordinated her own ambitions to his advancement, who had mistaken accommodation for partnership. The past months had painfully but irrevocably transformed me, awakening aspects of identity that had been dormant for decades. "No, Richard," I said quietly but firmly. "There's no going back. Not after this." He nodded, accepting my response with a resignation that suggested he had anticipated it. "I understand. I just needed to ask." We sat in silence for a moment, two people who had shared a bed, raised a child, and built a life together, now separated by more than just the cafe table between us. The waitress refilled our coffee cups, oblivious to the weight of the moment she had interrupted. "There's something else I wanted to discuss," Richard said finally, his tone shifting toward the pragmatic. "I've been thinking about the settlement, negotiations, about what's fair given everything that's happened." I tensed, immediately wary. Richard's concept of fairness had always been filtered through his own interests, his assessment of what was reasonable colored by what benefited him most directly. "I've instructed my attorney to stop contesting your claims to the retirement, accounts, and the house," he continued. "You're right that your contributions to my career were substantial and deserve recognition in the financial settlement. The aggressive position we initially took was..." He paused, seemingly searching for the right word. "Inappropriate given the circumstances of our marriage and its end." The concession was unexpected, representing a significant departure from the contentious negotiating stance his attorney had maintained thus far. While Elaine had been confident in our eventual success given the length of our marriage and my documented contributions to Richard's career, she had warned me to expect a protracted legal battle, particularly over the retirement accounts that represented our most substantial assets. "What prompted this change?" I asked, suspicious of apparent generosity after months of legal obstruction. Richard's expression revealed a complex mixture of emotions: regret, resignation, and something that might have been genuine remorse. "Emma came to see me," he admitted. "She brought financial records, documentation of all the ways you supported my career while setting aside your own professional development. She had spreadsheets, Catherine, detailed calculations of the economic value of the work you did without compensation." The revelation that Emma had confronted her father independently, armed with data and analysis, left me momentarily speechless. While I had been aware of her involvement in gathering financial documents for our legal team, I hadn't realized she had compiled her own case or that she had presented it directly to Richard. "She didn't tell me," I said, processing this new information. Emma had always been fiercely protective, but this level of advocacy represented a role reversal I found both touching and troubling. A child shouldn't have to defend her mother's economic contributions to her father. "She was quite impressive," Richard acknowledged, a hint of the proud professor emerging briefly. "Methodical, well-researched, impossible to dismiss with emotional deflections. She called it my final exam on ethical economics." A faint smile touched his lips despite the circumstances. "She's going to be formidable in her field." "What exactly did she say to you?" I asked, curious about the conversation that had apparently prompted this significant shift in Richard's position. He looked uncomfortable, suggesting Emma's assessment had been more pointed than he cared to. "Repeat." "She made it clear that my treatment of you contradicted everything I've ever taught about economic justice and fair valuation of labor. She used my own published works on equity theory against me quite effectively." After a pause, he added quietly, "She also said that if I continued fighting you on the financial settlement, she would consider it confirmation that I valued academic principles only when they didn't cost me personally." The elegant brutality of Emma's argument, using Richard's own scholarly framework to highlight his personal hypocrisy, was breathtaking in its precision. She had identified exactly the pressure point that would affect her father most deeply: the contradiction between his professional identity as an ethical economic theorist and his personal behavior in our divorce. "I need to think about your offer," I said finally, unwilling to commit to anything without consulting Elaine. "I appreciate the gesture, but I'll need to discuss this with my attorney." Richard nodded, seemingly disappointed, but not surprised by my caution. "Of course. I've already communicated my position to Bradley. He'll be in touch with Elaine to formalize the changes to our proposal." As our conversation wound down, I found myself studying the man across from me with new clarity. For decades, I had viewed Richard through the lens of admiration and accommodation, magnifying his strengths while minimizing his failings. Now I saw him more completely: brilliant but deeply flawed, capable of both intellectual generosity and profound selfishness, a complex human rather than the idealized academic partner I had constructed in my mind. "I should go," I said, gathering my purse and jacket. "I have a meeting at the Historical Society." Richard's expression registered genuine curiosity. "Martha mentioned you were working on some art restoration project. Something connected to your graduate work?" The question felt like a small acknowledgement of the intellectual interests I had subordinated during our marriage. "The WPA murals from the Murray Building," I confirmed. "They're being conserved for installation at the new community center." "You always had remarkable insight into Depression-era public art," Richard said, his tone carrying a hint of the respectful colleague rather than the dismissive husband. "I still remember your analysis of economic theory's influence on the artistic commissions." It was what made me agree to consult on your exhibition." The compliment, delivered without the patronizing quality that had often characterized his assessment of my intellectual work during our marriage, created a strange moment of connection, not as estranged spouses, but as academic peers acknowledging shared intellectual territory. "The Historical Society has asked me to curate the permanent installation and develop the educational materials," I added, a small note of pride entering my voice. "They've applied for a Humanities Council grant to fund a part-time curatorial position. If it's approved, they've indicated I would be their first choice." Richard seemed genuinely pleased by this development. "That's excellent, Catherine. It's a perfect application of your expertise." After a slight hesitation, he added, "I should have encouraged you to pursue curatorial work more actively years ago. Instead, I allowed your career to become secondary to mine. That was short-sighted." The admission, perhaps the first genuine acknowledgement from Richard that my professional sacrifices had been significant, arrived too late to heal the eye. Damage, but early enough to provide a small measure of validation. "Yes," I agreed simply. "It was." We parted with an awkward half-embrace, neither the passionate kiss of reunited lovers nor the cold handshake of adversaries, but something in between, a physical acknowledgement of shared history and irreversible change. As I watched Richard walk to his car, his shoulders slumped in a way I had never observed during our marriage, I felt an unexpected emotion surface through the complex layers of hurt and anger. Compassion. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition of our common humanity, our shared fallibility. The following weeks brought a flurry of activity as the revised settlement terms were formalized. With Richard's new cooperative stance, processes that Elaine had warned might take a year or more were resolved in a matter of months. The house would remain mine, along with a fair portion of the retirement accounts and continued health insurance coverage through Richard's faculty benefits. In exchange, I waived claims to his future book royalties and speaking fees, a concession that felt reasonable given my desire for a clean break. As these practical matters reached resolution, another transition loomed: Emma's departure for graduate school in September. Though her program was just 3 hours away, the approaching separation weighed heavily on me. During the past tumultuous months, her presence had been my most consistent source of stability and support. The prospect of rattling around our family home alone, surrounded by memories and untethered from daily purpose, filled me with quiet dread. Martha, with her characteristic perceptiveness, recognized this unspoken anxiety during one of our regular lunch meetings. "You need to seize this moment," she declared, fixing me with her direct gaze across the restaurant table. "Emma's launching her adult life. Your divorce is nearly finalized. This is your opportunity for redirection, not just reaction." "Redirection to what?" I asked, the question emerging more plaintively than I'd intended. At 51, with a fragmented work history and specialized education completed decades earlier, my professional options seemed limited at best. "That's exactly what you need to figure out," Martha replied, undeterred by my skepticism. "Not what's available to you, but what you want." What would Catherine pursue if she weren't considering limitations first? The question lingered with me as I drove home, its seemingly simple formulation revealing how completely I had internalized a life defined by accommodation and constraint. Even my recent involvement with the Historical Society project, though personally fulfilling, had begun as a suggestion from Martha rather than an independent initiative. I had been reacting to opportunities presented rather than actively creating my own path. That evening, sitting alone in my study, the room I had once used primarily for managing household accounts and organizing Richard's academic calendar, I allowed myself to contemplate Martha's question without the immediate filter of practicality. What did I want professionally? What intellectual pursuits had been set aside in the gradual subordination of my ambitions to Richard's career? My graduate research on New Deal art programs had examined the intersection of economic policy, public funding, and artistic creation during national crisis. How economic necessity had paradoxically created space for unprecedented government. Support of the arts. The WPA murals I was currently helping restore represented just one manifestation of that complex historical moment when economic catastrophe had generated cultural flourishing through innovative public policy. As I considered these connections, a half-formed idea began to take shape. Not just the restoration and documentation of these artistic artifacts, but a broader examination of how economic disruption throughout American history had influenced cultural production and institutional support for the arts. The Historical Society project could be expanded, contextualized within larger patterns of economic and cultural policy. The intellectual excitement this line of thinking generated surprised me with its intensity. For years, I had channeled my analytical capabilities into supporting Richard's work, editing his manuscripts, organizing his research notes, providing thoughtful feedback on his drafts. Now those same capabilities turned toward my own intellectual interests, created a different quality of engagement, a more direct connection between thought and purpose. On impulse, I opened my laptop and began researching academic programs in cultural policy, museum studies, and arts administration. Most required credentials I didn't possess, or full-time commitments I couldn't make given my financial circumstances. But several universities offered certificate programs or part-time master's degrees designed for mid-career professionals seeking to formalize expertise gained through practical experience. One program particularly caught my attention: a hybrid master's degree in cultural heritage management at a university an hour's drive from Westlake. The program combined online coursework with weekend residencies, specifically designed for working professionals with relevant experience, but without traditional academic backgrounds in the field. The application deadline for spring admission was just 2 weeks away. "You should absolutely apply," Emma declared when I tentatively mentioned the program over breakfast the next morning. "Your work with the Historical Society already aligns with the program focus, and your art history background gives you a strong foundation." "I'm not sure." I hesitated, the ingrained habit of self-limitation asserting itself despite my initial enthusiasm. "The tuition is significant, and I'm still adjusting to our new financial reality. Plus, I'd be at least 20 years older than most students." Emma fixed me with the penetrating gaze she had inherited from Richard, but deployed with greater emotional intelligence. "Mom, you spent 2 decades supporting Dad's career and education goals. You put aside your own professional development to create the stable home environment that allowed him to advance. Now it's your turn." The simple assertion of my right to prioritize my own development after years of supporting Richard's ambitions resonated deeply. "But the practical considerations," I began, only to be interrupted by Emma's firm headshake. "The practical considerations would work themselves out," she insisted. "The settlement provides financial stability. The Historical Society position could connect directly to your studies. And the program is specifically designed for non-traditional students with professional experience." She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers, a reversal of the comforting gesture I had offered her countless times throughout her childhood. "Mom, you spent my entire life showing me how to support others' dreams. Now I need you to show me how to pursue your own." The quiet challenge in her words, the recognition that my choices now would model possibilities for her future, proved more motivating than any consideration of personal ambition. Throughout Emma's life, I had encouraged her to believe in her capabilities, to pursue her interests with confidence, to value her intellectual contributions. What message would I send if, when finally presented with opportunity for my own growth, I retreated into safe limitations? That afternoon, I began working on my application materials, crafting a personal statement that traced the unconventional path that had led me to this juncture. My early academic training in art history, my years of museum work, my recent involvement with the Historical Society Restoration Project. I contacted former professors and colleagues for recommendations, some of whom expressed surprise at hearing from me after so many years, but responded with encouraging support. I remember your insightful analysis of economic influences on public art commissions, wrote my former thesis advisor, now emeritus at the university where I had completed my master's degree. Your perspective was ahead of its time in recognizing the complex interplay between economic policy and cultural production. I'm delighted to see you returning to these intellectual interests. 6 months later, I stood at a podium in the newly renovated Murray Community Center, addressing the gathered crowd at the official unveiling of the restored WPA murals. The audience included historical society members, local officials, arts patrons, and curious community members. From my vantage point, I could see familiar faces, Martha beaming proudly in the front row, Emma home for spring break sitting beside her, and in the back, partially obscured by a column but unmistakably present, Richard. These murals don't just represent our town's history, I explained, gesturing to the vibrant panels displaying agricultural and industrial scenes from the 1930s. They embody a moment when economic crisis gave birth to unprecedented cultural opportunity, when artists who might otherwise have abandoned their craft found support through innovative public policy. As I spoke about the murals' historical significance, their artistic merit, and the painstaking conservation process, I felt a quiet confidence that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. The month since beginning my graduate program had transformed me in ways both subtle and profound. My classmates, diverse in age and background, had welcomed my perspective, valuing the lived experience I brought to theoretical discussions. My professors had encouraged me to publish my research on the intersection of economic policy and artistic production, suggesting it had relevance for contemporary cultural funding debates. Today, as we dedicate these restored artworks to the community, we're not just preserving our past, I concluded. We're affirming our belief that cultural heritage deserves investment even, perhaps especially, during times of personal and collective transformation. The applause that followed felt like validation, not just of my presentation, but of the journey that had brought me to this moment. When Eleanor Jenkins, the Historical Society director, joined me at the podium to announce that the Humanities Council grant had been approved, funding my position as permanent curator of the installation, the audience's enthusiastic response brought unexpected tears to my eyes. After the ceremony, as attendees mingled around the reception tables, Emma approached with a proud smile. "Professor Walsh," she teased, referencing the title some younger Historical Society volunteers had begun using despite my protests. "That was brilliant. You found your voice." Walking out of the community center into the cool spring evening, I felt a profound sense of alignment, of intellectual purpose connecting to personal passion, of professional identity, reinforcing rather than diminishing personal worth. The future stretching before me was not the one I had planned throughout my marriage, but its unexpected contours now felt less like limitation and more like liberation. The grant confirmation arrived on the anniversary of Richard's announcement at Emma's graduation party, exactly 1 year since the implosion of my carefully constructed life. I sat at my desk in the Historical Society office, staring at the email with its formal language and bureaucratic formatting that belied its transformative significance. The National Endowment for the Humanities had approved full funding for our proposal, Economic Crisis and Cultural Renaissance, Documenting America's Public Art Legacy. As project director, I would lead a team documenting and digitizing Depression-era public artworks across 3 states, creating both a scholarly database and educational resources accessible to communities where these works resided. The 2-year appointment included not just a substantial salary, but funding for a small staff, travel expenses, and technical support. "You did it!" Eleanor exclaimed, rushing into my office after receiving her copy of the notification. "When you first suggested expanding beyond our local murals, I thought it was ambitious. When you proposed applying for federal funding, I thought it was a long shot. I've never been happier to be wrong. Her enthusiasm matched the magnitude of the achievement, but part of me remained suspended in disbelief. A year ago, I had been planning a graduation party and contemplating bathroom renovations, my professional ambitions atrophied by decades of accommodation. Now, I stood on the threshold of directing a major humanities project that connected directly to the research interests I had abandoned when marriage redefined my priorities. That evening, I hosted a small celebration at my home, not the formal faculty dinner parties I had orchestrated throughout my marriage, with their careful attention to academic hierarchies and departmental politics, but a gathering of the people who had supported my unexpected reinvention. Martha and her husband, Eleanor and the Historical Society board president, 2 classmates from my graduate program, and Emma, home for the summer before her 2nd year of graduate studies. "To Catherine," Martha proposed, raising her glass as we gathered around the patio table I had set with casual elegance, "who reminded all of us that it's never too late to reclaim your path. And who's going to make us all look lazy by completing a master's degree, directing a federal grant project, and curating a permanent installation simultaneously," added Jacob, my 70-year-old classmate who had begun his museum studies degree after retiring from dentistry. The conversation flowed with an ease that contrasted sharply with the carefully managed academic gatherings of my previous life. Ideas were exchanged without concern for professional status or departmental rivalries. Laughter erupted frequently and naturally. Most striking was the realization that every person present knew me as Catherine Henderson, scholar and curator, rather than Catherine Walsh, faculty wife. My identity existed independently, defined by my own accomplishments rather than my relationship to a prestigious academic. As twilight softened the garden and the gathering moved into a more reflective mood, Emma slipped into the chair beside me. "I have something for you," she said, handing me a small wrapped package. "I was saving it for your graduation next spring, but tonight seems right." Inside was a business card holder crafted from polished wood, elegant in its simplicity. And, tucked inside, a set of newly printed cards. Catherine Henderson, M.A., Project Director, Public Art Legacy Initiative. "You ordered these before the grant was even confirmed," I observed, touched by her confidence in an outcome that had seemed far from certain. "I never doubted you would succeed," she said simply. "Once you finally started pursuing what you wanted, instead of facilitating everyone else's goals, your trajectory was inevitable." After my guests departed, I lingered on the patio, savoring the quiet satisfaction of the evening. The phone call, when it came, was unexpected, Richard's name appearing on my caller ID for the first time in months. Our communication had been limited to occasional emails regarding final divorce details, handled with the formal politeness of distant acquaintances rather than former partners. "I hope I'm not calling too late," he began awkwardly when I answered. "I just heard about the NEH grant. Mark mentioned it at faculty dinner. Congratulations, Catherine. It's an extraordinary achievement." "Thank you," I replied, surprised by his outreach but no longer destabilized by his attention. "It's an exciting opportunity. I always knew you had remarkable insight into the intersection of economic policy and cultural production," he continued. "Your graduate work was ahead of its time in recognizing patterns that have become central to contemporary cultural economics." The compliment was genuine, I believed, but struck me as a revision of history. Throughout our marriage, Richard had treated my academic interests as quaint diversions rather than serious intellectual pursuits. He had encouraged my museum work primarily for its flexibility around his schedule, not for its connection to my scholarly passions. "That's kind of you to say," I responded neutrally. A pause followed, filled with unspoken recalibration. "I've been thinking about our conversation at Emma's graduation," Richard finally said, referencing our last substantive exchange months earlier, "about intellectual compatibility and shared goals. The irony is that you and I actually had more genuine intellectual connection than I recognized. I mistook your support for subservience, your adaptation for limitation. The observation was surprisingly perceptive coming from someone whose self-absorption had defined our relationship. Perhaps, I acknowledged, unwilling to either confirm or deny his reassessment of our past. What mattered now was not the accuracy of his revised understanding, but my liberation from needing his validation. The department is considering developing a cross-disciplinary program in cultural economics, he continued. Given your project's focus, there might be opportunities for collaboration. Guest lectures, perhaps, or co-sponsored events with the Historical Society. The suggestion represented a complete inversion of our previous dynamic, Richard proposing a professional collaboration where I would be the primary expert, the institutional funding attached to my project rather than his department. A year ago, such recognition would have seemed miraculous validation. Now it registered as merely interesting, a potential professional opportunity to be evaluated on its practical merits rather than its emotional significance. That might be worth exploring once the project is established, I replied, my tone pleasant, but non-committal. You could contact our outreach coordinator when we've finalized our programming schedule. His slight hesitation suggested he had expected greater enthusiasm for this potential reconnection. Of course, I'll have my assistant reach out through proper channels. After we ended the call, I remained on the patio, reflecting on the strange symmetry of the moment. A year ago, Richard's public announcement had shattered my carefully constructed identity as his supportive partner. Tonight, his phone call had confirmed its irrelevance to my reconstructed sense of self. The professional validation he offered, once so desperately craved, now held no more weight than approval from any other academic colleague. As I gathered the remaining glasses from the celebration, I realized that the completion of my healing had arrived not in the grant announcement or my academic achievements, but in this moment of genuine indifference to Richard's assessment. The woman who had organized her existence around his approval had disappeared so gradually, I hadn't noticed her final departure. In her place stood someone both familiar and new, a scholar reclaiming interrupted work, a mother celebrating her daughter's independence, a woman discovering that the scaffold of marriage had concealed rather than supported her true structure. The future stretching before me contained challenges and uncertainties, but for the first time in decades, the path was unquestionably my own.